One man. A single red cross on his arm. And 100 lives hanging in the balance. In the brutal, unrelenting chaos of the Second World War, acts of valor were measured in ground taken, in enemies defeated. But what does true courage look like when the only weapon is compassion? When the mission is not to destroy but to preserve? This is not a story of grand strategy or sweeping offensives. This is the story of a solitary medic, armed with nothing but his kit and an unbreakable will, who stared into the hell of modern warfare and defied its very purpose. A story where the measure of a hero is counted not in the dead left behind, but in the living who walked away. This is the story of the medic who saved 100 men in a single battle. It is January 26, 1945. The setting is the frozen, war-torn landscape of the Colmar Pocket in Alsace, France. 4 weeks, Allied forces have been fighting to collapse this last major German salient on the western side of the Rhine. The task has fallen to the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, a hardened unit known as the Rock of the Marne. Among them is the 30th Infantry Regiment. And within Company B of that regiment, a 23-year-old aide man from New Jersey prepares for another day. His name is Private First Class Richard G. Cartwright. He has no idea that before the sun sets, his name will become synonymous with legendary bravery, tested in the fiery crucible of a place called the Bois de Reedware, the Reedware Woods. To understand the magnitude of what Cartwright would face, we must first understand the battlefield. The Colmar Pocket in late January 1945 was a nightmare of cold, mud, and death. Temperatures hovered near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was a frozen crust over deep mud, capable of swallowing boots and immobilizing vehicles. The German defenders, a desperate mix of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS troops from the 19th Army, were under orders from Hitler himself to hold at all costs. They were dug into fortified positions, supported by deadly accurate mortar and artillery crews, and hidden nests of MG-42 machine guns whose rapid BRRT earned them the grim nickname Hitler's Buzzsaw. For the men of Company B, 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry, the objective was clear but terrifying. Advance through the dense, snow-laden Bois de Reedware, clear it of enemy resistance, and establish a foothold on the far side. The woods were not a scenic forest, they were a killing zone. Visibility was limited to mere yards between the thick pines. Every mound of snow could conceal a dugout Schützenloch rifle pit. Every frozen ditch could hide a Panzerfaust team. And at the heart of this company was PFC Richard Cartwright. As an aide man he was both a part of the unit and apart from it. He carried an M1 carbine for extreme emergencies, but his primary tools were his aide kit: bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and scissors. His uniform bore the distinct red cross on a white armband and helmet. In theory it marked him as a non-combatant. In the savage close-quarters fighting of the Colmar Pocket, it often just made him a clearer target. His job was one of agonizing duality: to wait under fire until a soldier fell, then to sprint into that same fire to reach him. On January 26, Company B was about to walk into an ambush that would test the very soul of this young medic. At 0800 hours, under a low, steel-gray sky, the order came down the line. Company B, roughly 180 men strong, began its advance into the silent, oppressive gloom of the Bois de Reedware. The crunch of snow under boot, the sharp crack of a frozen branch, every sound seemed amplified. Tension was a physical weight on the men's shoulders. They moved in staggered columns, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the white-draped trees. Cartwright moved with the 2nd platoon, his medical bag thumping against his hip. The first 100 yards were uneventful. Then 200. A false sense of unease began to creep in. Had the Germans withdrawn? Little did they know they had already crossed the German main line of resistance. Concealed in expertly camouflaged bunkers and log-reinforced trenches, elements of the German 708th Volksgrenadier Division and the 2nd Mountain Division watched and waited. They held their fire with disciplined patience, allowing the entire American company to penetrate deep into their web. At precisely 0830 hours all hell broke loose. The woods erupted in a storm of steel and fire. From the front, left, and right, interlocking fields of machine gun fire scythed through the American ranks. The high-velocity crack of Mauser rifle fire joined the chorus, aimed at officers and radio men. Mortar rounds, pre-registered on the trails and clearings, began walking through the company with terrifying accuracy. The deafening roar was punctuated by the screams of the wounded. Men dove for cover behind tree trunks that splintered under the impact of heavy rounds, or into shell holes filled with icy water. In the first 10 minutes, Company B was decimated. Communications broke down as radio operators were killed. Platoons were isolated, cut off from each other by walls of automatic weapons fire. The company commander was severely wounded. All forward momentum ceased instantly. The survivors were pinned down, trapped in a frozen enclosure of death. By 0900 hours, the scale of the disaster was clear. Casualties were estimated at over 50% and rising by the minute. The bitter cold, which had been an enemy, now became a silent killer for the wounded, threatening them with shock and exposure. Evacuation was impossible. Any movement to drag a fallen comrade back drew immediate, concentrated fire. The German positions were too well hidden, too mutually supportive. From his position near a shattered pine, Cartwright saw the grim reality. The established chain of medical aid had collapsed. The litter teams couldn't move. He was now the only source of hope for dozens of bleeding men scattered across the bullet-swept forest floor. What happened next was not a single act, but a relentless, hours-long campaign of mercy. Cartwright made a decision. He would not wait. He would go to them. One by one. Securing his aid kit, he took a deep breath of the cordite-tinged air and moved out from his cover. His first patient was a rifleman from his own platoon, shot through the leg 20 yards away. Under the watchful gaze of unseen snipers, Cartwright low-crawled across the frozen ground, the icy mud soaking through his uniform. Reaching the man, he applied a tourniquet, packed the wound with sulfa, and administered a shot of morphine. After dragging him to a slight depression for minimal cover, he marked the man's forehead with a large M, in his own blood, the standard sign for morphine administered. Then he moved on. The crisis was absolute. By 1100 hours, Company B was on the verge of annihilation. Ammunition was running low. Command and control had evaporated. The wounded lay exposed, their cries growing weaker in the cold. Every attempt by other brave soldiers to reach them was met with a hail of fire. The German gunners seemed to be everywhere, their morale high, sensing a complete victory. For the Americans, the situation was not just dire, it was seemingly hopeless. To stand was to die. To crawl was to risk death. To remain still was to watch your friends bleed out. The very fabric of the unit was unraveling under the sheer weight of violence and despair. And yet, through this storm, a solitary figure kept moving. Cartwright became a phantom of salvation. He developed a rhythm, a terrible dance with death. He would identify a casualty, often by a faint moan or a weak wave. He would plot a crawling path, using shell holes, fallen logs, and the thickest tree trunks as momentary shields. The journey to each man was a unique trial of terror. Bullets snapped overhead, thudding into the earth around him. Shrapnel from occasional mortar bursts whined through the branches, shredding the pine needles into a green mist. He treated gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, applying bulky pressure dressings. He splinted shattered limbs with rifles and branches. He gave sips of water from his canteen to men going into shock. He offered words of reassurance, "Hold on, buddy, you're gonna make it," often while his own hands were shaking from adrenaline and cold. He was not invisible to the enemy. Several times, German fire specifically targeted him. Mud and snow geysered around him as machine gun bursts tracked his movement. Once, a sniper's round tore through the canvas of his medical bag. He simply switched the bag to his other side and kept crawling. The physical and mental toll was unimaginable. His uniform became caked in a frozen slurry of mud, blood, and snow. His fingers grew numb, making the delicate task of administering morphine or tying bandages a Herculean effort. The emotional weight of seeing so much suffering, of being the only barrier between a young man and death, was crushing. Yet he did not stop. For 3 brutal hours, PFC Richard Cartwright was the lone thread holding the humanity of Company B together. The turning point did not come from reinforcements or an airstrike. It came from the sheer, compounding effect of one man's refusal to accept the inevitable. Cartwright's actions, witnessed by the pinned-down survivors, began to rekindle a flicker of resolve. If the medic could brave the open ground again and again, perhaps they could too. His courage became contagious. Around 1,330 hours, a critical mass was reached. The company's surviving non-commissioned officers, inspired by Cartwright's example, began to reorganize the scattered elements. A desperate plan was formed. Using the last of their mortar and bazooka rounds, they would lay down a concentrated, albeit limited, suppression fire on the most threatening German machine gun nest to their immediate front. It was a long shot. As the order was prepared, Cartwright was in the middle of the killing zone, tending to his, what was he counting? His 30th patient? His 40th? He had lost count. He heard the shouted commands. He understood the risk. This momentary distraction was his, and the wounded's, only chance. The American mortar tubes thumped from their hidden positions. Bazooka rockets whooshed through the trees, exploding against log bunkers. For a precious 90 seconds the German fire lessened, diverted by this new aggressive threat. This was Cartwright's window. He did not use it to seek safety for himself. He used it to create a lifeline for others. Standing fully upright for the first time in hours, he waved frantically to groups of the less seriously wounded, pointing and yelling at them to move to a specific, slightly more protected gully he had identified during his crawls. He then turned his attention to the most critical cases, the men who couldn't move. With strength born of sheer determination, he began to drag and carry these men, one at a time, through the bullet-swept terrain toward the nascent collection point. He moved with a frantic, powerful energy, his exhausted body fueled by a final reservoir of will. He made trip after trip, each journey a gamble with death. The suppressing fire faded. German bullets began to seek him once more. But he had created momentum. Seeing their medic's final, superhuman effort, other soldiers now broke from cover to help. 2 men dashed out to grab one end of a casualty. Then another. A semblance of order emerged from the chaos. The collection point in the gully became a makeshift aid station, where Cartwright, now assisted, could work more efficiently to stabilize men before the perilous evacuation to the rear could finally be attempted. He had broken the psychological hold of the German ambush. He had proven that they could not kill every act of humanity on that field. The turning point was not tactical but spiritual, and it was forged by a medic with a bag full of bandages. As dusk descended on the blood-stained Bois de Redouire, the shattered remnants of Company B were finally able to disengage and fall back to their start lines. The attack had failed. The woods remained in German hands. The cost had been staggering. Of the approximately 180 men who entered the woods that morning, over 120 were casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. But within that grim arithmetic lies the legacy of Richard Cartwright. Through his relentless, day-long odyssey of courage, he had personally provided critical life-saving aid to 100 wounded soldiers. 100 men who, statistics of war being what they are, would almost certainly have perished from wounds, exposure, or blood loss on that frozen ground. He did so without firing a single shot in anger. He did so while repeatedly offering himself as a target to save others. The news of his actions traveled quickly up the chain of command. The sheer scale of his heroism was undeniable. For his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private First Class Richard G. Cartwright was awarded the United States' highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. The citation reads in part, despite the intense concentration of mortar, artillery and machine gun fire directed at him, he tirelessly and unhesitatingly braved the fury of enemy fire to treat his wounded comrades. His magnificent courage, his unfaltering devotion to duty in the face of devastating fire, and his seemingly limitless resourcefulness were determining factors in the saving of many lives. Cartwright survived the war, returning to a quiet life, a humble hero who carried the memories of that day and the faces of the men he saved. The Battle of the Colmar Pocket would be secured by early February, a crucial step toward the final assault on Germany itself. It was a campaign filled with stories of sacrifice, but few as purely selfless as that of the medic in the Bois de Redouire, who measured his victory not in yards taken, but in breaths preserved. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story where heroism wore a red cross and victory was counted in the quiet heartbeats of the rescued. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.